Imagine an entire country running out of fuel. Not slowly, not over decades, but in weeks. Hospitals lose power. Trucks that carry food from farms to cities stop moving. Airports shut down, not because of war, but because there is no jet fuel left in the tanks. Families cook over wood fires in the capital of a nation that once exported doctors to the world. The lights go out for 10, 15, 20 hours a day, and the government, the one that survived the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 60 years of American embargo, goes on television and says, "We are ready to talk." This is not a movie. This is Cuba, February 2026. And the story of how it got here is not about politics or ideology. It is about oil, dependency, and the oldest financial trap in history: building your entire economy on someone else's resources. Welcome to the financial system. Control the money, control the history. And remember, simple is never easy. To understand why Cuba is suffocating right now, you have to go back to 1959. When Castro's revolution overthrew the Batista regime, Cuba was deeply tied to the American economy. American companies ran the oil refineries. American buyers consumed the sugar. Castro nationalized everything. Washington responded with an embargo, and Cuba, an island with almost no oil of its own, suddenly needed a new lifeline. The Soviet Union provided it. Moscow sent oil to Havana in exchange for sugar, a barter deal that kept the island alive for 3 decades. Soviet subsidies averaged over $4 billion a year by the late 1980s. Oil alone covered 98% of Cuba's needs. The island ran its power plants, its buses, its factories, all on Soviet crude. It even re-exported surplus oil for hard currency, making petroleum Cuba's second-largest export. On the surface, it looked like prosperity. Underneath, it was total dependency. Cuba had traded one master for another, and that is a financial mistake no nation recovers from easily. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The oil stopped. Overnight, Cuba's imports dropped to 10% of what they had been. Factories shut down, transport vanished, the power grid collapsed into rolling blackouts lasting 18 hours. Farmers couldn't run tractors, so they turned to oxen. Cubans lost an average of 12 pounds per person from malnutrition. Over 50,000 people developed optic nerve damage from vitamin deficiency. This was the special period, Cuba's euphemism for economic freefall. The GDP shrank by 35%. Thousands fled on rafts. The government legalized the US dollar, opened the country to tourism, and invited foreign capital in. Survival demanded compromise. But here is where the pattern repeats. Because Cuba did not learn the lesson. It did not diversify. It did not build energy independence. It found a new patron instead. In 1998, Hugo Chávez was elected president of Venezuela. By the year 2000, Havana and Caracas had signed a barter deal that would define Cuba's economy for the next quarter century. Venezuela sent up to 100,000 barrels of oil per day. In return, Cuba sent doctors, teachers, sports trainers, and military advisors. It was sugar for oil reborn. The same structure, a different flag. Cuba had once again made its survival dependent on the political stability of a single foreign government. And political stability, as history teaches, is the most unreliable currency of all. For a while, the oil flowed freely. Cuba paid off debts, rebuilt tourism, and maintained its social model. Venezuelan oil generated more revenue than rum, cigars, or anything else Cuba produced. But Venezuela was rotting from within. When Chávez died in 2013 and Maduro took power, the Venezuelan economy began its long implosion. Oil production collapsed from over 3 million barrels a day to barely 500,000 by 2020. The 100,000 barrels Cuba once received shrank to 35,000. The pipeline was drying up years before anyone cut it off. Cuba's power grid, built on aging Soviet-era plants burning heavy crude with corrosive sulfur, began failing repeatedly. Blackouts returned. By 2024, Havana was losing power for 10 hours a day. In the provinces, 20 hours of darkness became routine. The infrastructure was collapsing, not from sanctions alone, but from decades of deferred maintenance and zero investment. Then came January 2026. The United States launched a military operation in Venezuela. Maduro was captured. The U.S. Navy moved to block Venezuelan oil exports. Cuba's largest remaining source of crude was severed overnight. Mexico, which had quietly become Cuba's second biggest oil supplier, providing nearly 44% of imports, came under immediate American pressure. Trump signed an executive order threatening tariffs on any nation that sold oil to Cuba. Mexico suspended shipments on January 27th. By early February, Cuba had not received a single oil delivery since December. The Financial Times reported that reserves could last only 15 to 20 days. An island of 11 million people was running on fumes. What followed was a cascade that reveals how oil is not just fuel, it is the circulatory system of a modern economy. Without it, Cuba's power grid collapsed into total blackout across 5 eastern provinces. Hospitals canceled surgeries. Critical supplies, painkillers, antibiotics, gauze became unavailable. Schools shortened their days. Government offices moved to 4-day weeks. Bus stops emptied because there were no buses. Farmers couldn't move harvests. Food prices surged. And then the airports went dark. Cuba notified international airlines that refueling services would be suspended for a full month. Air Canada canceled all flights. Tourism, the island's most critical source of hard currency, collapsed during peak season. The United Nations warned of humanitarian collapse if Cuba's oil needs went unmet. Russia called the situation truly critical. China pledged support but offered no tankers. And Díaz-Canel, the man who weeks earlier had spoken of resisting American imperialism, went on national television and said Cuba was ready to negotiate with Washington without preconditions. This is the moment the story becomes larger than Cuba. Because what you're watching is not just a fuel crisis. It is a case study in the most dangerous financial pattern in history: single-source dependency. Cuba has now lived through 3 versions of the same catastrophe. First, when the Americans cut it off in 1960, then when the Soviets collapsed in 1991, and now when Venezuela fell and Mexico stepped back in 2026. 3 different eras, 3 different patrons, the same structural failure. The patron changes, the dependency doesn't. And every time, the people at the bottom, the families cooking over fires, the patients in hospitals without electricity, the workers whose wages buy less every week, they are the ones who absorb the cost. Not the elites, not the party officials, the ordinary people, always. Cuba could produce about 40% of the oil it needs from its own fields, but decades of underinvestment, crumbling infrastructure, and the use of corrosive domestic crude without proper refining capacity meant that even domestic production kept declining, falling 37% between 2003 and 2020. Meanwhile, the government announced grand plans for renewable energy, solar, wind, but investment never materialized. When Díaz-Canel went on television in February 2026 promising to ramp up solar generation and boost domestic crude extraction, it was an admission that should have been made 20 years ago. You cannot build an energy transition in the middle of a blackout. You build it before the blackout comes. And Cuba chose again and again to rely on the next patron instead of relying on itself. The broader lesson extends far beyond this island. Every nation that stakes its survival on a single commodity, a single trading partner, or a single geopolitical alliance is building on borrowed ground. The oil for doctors deal looked brilliant in 2002. By 2026, it looked like a death sentence. And the pattern is universal. Europe discovered its dependency on Russian gas in 2022. Dozens of developing nations discovered their dependency on dollar-denominated debt during every interest rate hike. Dependency is invisible in good times and lethal in bad ones. That is the financial trap, and it works on individuals just as ruthlessly as it works on nations. If your income depends on one employer, one client, one asset, you are Cuba. You just haven't had your oil cut off yet. So what is the real takeaway? That energy independence is not a slogan. It is survival. Cuba had 67 years to diversify its energy sources and chose every single time to rely on foreign patrons instead. The cost of that choice is now measured in darkened hospitals and empty gas stations. That dependency is the most expensive currency in the world. It feels free when the oil is flowing, but when the tap is turned off by a war, a collapse, a single phone call from a foreign president, you discover the price was always deferred, never avoided. Cuba is not just running out of oil. It is running out of the illusion that dependency can be managed forever. The Soviet Union promised forever. Venezuela promised forever. And now, 11 million people sit in the dark, wondering who will promise next and whether any promise is worth believing. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme here is ancient. When you build your house on borrowed ground, the landlord always comes to collect. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. It's financial system, and history leaves clues. I show you where the money leads.